Hi, Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and apart from Tolkien, I don't get too obsessive about much of any other form of fiction or entertainment or anything like that. I have my enjoyments, but Tolkien is the one I spend a lot of time on. But recently, I have found that I am semi-obsessed with an Australian kids show called Bluey. And these days it's kind of hard to escape it, so most of you probably at least are aware of the show. And it was interesting because we recently got season 3 on DVD, and I was working my way through some of the episodes, which are, with almost certain regularity, genius every other episode or so. And there's this one particular episode which struck a nerve that is, of course, a very Tolkienian one, which is why I'm going to be talking about it. That episode is called Born Yesterday. In the episode, and for those of you who aren't familiar with the TV show Bluey, it's about a family of blue heeler dogs living in Australia who are, of course, anthropomorphized. Bluey, the sort of main character, is a 6, or depending on where you are in season 3, 7-year-old who has a younger sister named Bingo and a mommy and daddy named Chili and Bandit, respectively. In this one particular episode, Chili, the mom, is doing some, I guess, yoga or something, in mirroring a TV program or video that she's watching, and the girls come in and they're playing like they're tourists and taking pictures of everything. They start taking pictures of her rear end, which she says is inappropriate. The dad walks in, whose name is Bandit, and Bluey asks him to bend over, and he says, "Well, I wasn't born yesterday." And the two kids, of course, are like, "Born yesterday? What are you talking about?" And he has to explain what the saying means. It means I'm not stupid. He didn't say that word, but I've been around long enough to know that what you're trying to ask me to do is not a good idea. And that gives the two girls a chance to come up with a game, which is half of what the whole show is about. Almost every other episode is basically them coming up with really bizarre but funny games to play. And in this particular instance, they ask their dad to pretend that he was in fact born yesterday. And then funny, and just interesting things ensue, as usually happens in this show. So the main point of the show is just kind of showing that a lot of the times in Bluey, there's kind of a moral lesson for the kids as well as, just something funny going on. And in this particular instance, what the kids kind of learn through watching their dad pretend to know nothing, including what the sun is, what, things are polite or impolite to do, what things are just socially awkward to do. For example, there's one point where he has this episode where he acts afraid of the sun, and they have to explain to him, "Oh, no, it's normal." And then they're walking along on the sidewalk, and they pass a bus stop where there's some lady dog sitting there, and he walks up to her, gets right in her face, and says, "Don't worry about the sun, it's normal." And they're like, "Don't do that." And he's like, "Why?" Because, of course, he's born yesterday. It doesn't know anything. And, they basically have to ultimately go back to that old, tried but not necessarily always true thing of, "I've been around, just trust me, I know." It's kind of the whole "because I said so" type of rationale when you tell your kids to do something they don't want to do, and you don't want to come up with a long-winded explanation. And Bluey basically just says, "It's hard to explain, but just trust us." Why? Because we've been around longer than you, and, this is kind of the moral lesson that the kids learn. But that was not actually the most interesting thing about the episode to me, because there's a much more Tolkienian idea that is kind of buried in it. At one point, they're walking around, and, he's kind of doing what you might expect somebody who knows nothing to do, and asking for the names of everything that he sees, because he's trying to learn it, and he doesn't know anything, so he was born yesterday. One time, he comes into an area where a leaf just falls out of a tree in front of him, and he asks what the name is, and Bluey, the older sister, tells Bingo, who's about to tell him, wait, every time we tell him the name of something, it just causes trouble. Let's just let him look. And so they tell him this. It's just like, it doesn't matter what the name is, just look. And so he holds the leaf up in front of his face, and the sun is kind of like directly in front of him. So he's looking through the leaf into the sun. And when he does this, it kind of zooms in, and it's animated. It's not showing us an actual leaf, but it's giving like a cartoonish idea of what the leaf would look like at almost a microscopic level if you really looked at it in that kind of light. And when he does, the music kind of swells a little bit, and you get the sense that he's actually discovering something, because he's looking at a leaf in a way he probably hasn't looked at a leaf since he was a baby, right? Well, at the end of the episode, they get back to their house, and the two girls say, "It's okay, you can stop pretending you were born yesterday." And so he says, "Okay," and walks off. They start unloading the dishwasher, which their mom had asked them to do way earlier in the episode. And then the mom walks in and commends them for doing the thing that she asked them to do. And she goes and gets water out of the sink, which is right next to a window. And she says, "Kids, is your dad still pretending to be born yesterday?" And they're like, "No." And she's like, "Okay." And then it pans out, the scene shifts to outside, and what we see is Bandit sitting in the grass again, holding a leaf in front of him, just looking at it with a smile on his face. That is the backdrop. Now you may be wondering, if you're not super into your Tolkien, how in the world this connects. But it's on fairy stories. And if you know you're on fairy stories, you probably know exactly where I'm going with this, because Tolkien, in his essay, or prepared remarks, which kind of become an essay, on fairy stories, says that there are kind of three primary goals of fairy tales. One is escape, one is consolation, and the other is recovery. Recovery is the recovery specifically of sort of a childlike wonder at the world and being able to see things as they are and not just as something that we pass by every day. So let me read you a few passages from his essay to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. He starts off talking about how things can become very stale and old and this sort of thing. And he says, "We do not, or need not, despair of drawing because all lines must be either curved or straight, nor of painting because there are only three primary colors. We may indeed be older now, insofar as we are heirs in enjoyment or in practice of many generations of ancestors in the arts. In this inheritance of wealth, there may be a danger of boredom, or of anxiety to be original, and that may lead to a distaste for fine drawing, delicate pattern, and pretty colors, or else to mere manipulation and over-elaboration of old material, clever and heartless." Here he's kind of almost giving a warning against postmodernism, because what he's about to say is, that doesn't mean we should get really bizarre with things. It doesn't mean we should, just go to the awkward or whatnot. And he says, before we reach such states, in other words, getting really weird just for the sake of the originality, we need recovery. We should look at green again and be startled anew, but not blinded, by blue and yellow and red. We should meet the centaur and the dragon, and then perhaps suddenly behold, like the ancient shepherds, sheep and dogs and horses and wolves. This recovery fairy stories help us to make. In that sense only, a taste for them may make us, or keep us, childish. So Tolkien is here talking about that, sense of the child, the person who doesn't know everything and who wants to learn it in intimate detail and really get it, not just look out and be like, things. So he follows up and he says, recovery, which includes return and renewal of health, is a regaining of a clear view. I do not say seeing things as they are and involve myself with the philosophers, though I might venture to say seeing things as we are or were meant to see them, as things apart from ourselves. We need in any case to clean our windows so that the things seen clearly may be freed from the drab blur of triteness or familiarity, from possessiveness. Of all faces, those of our familiaris are the ones both most difficult to play fantastic tricks with and most difficult really to see with fresh attention, perceiving their likeness and unlikeness, that they are faces and yet unique faces. This triteness is really the penalty of appropriation. The things that are trite, or, in a bad sense, familiar, are the things that we have appropriated, legally or mentally. We say we know them. They have become like the things which once attracted us by their glitter, or their color, or their shape, and we laid hands on them, and then locked them in our hoard, acquired them, and acquiring, ceased to look at them. Here, of course, we get... This is almost too on the nose in one sense, because he's basically telling us exactly how his dragons think. Smaug, Glaurung, all the dragons in his mythology seem to be in this vein of, I just want the stuff to have the stuff. Not because I want to look at it, because it's, marvelously and beautifully crafted, not because it's, particularly worthy in itself, but just to have it. And it's just mine. And he's basically saying we tend to do this mentally with our own things. Like, for example, I have these 3 swords back on my wall, of course, which I almost never look at with, any particular sense of, man, isn't that a beautiful piece of art anymore? Because it's just there. It's mine. Why do I need to look at it? It's a thing that we all do. I'm married. I look at my wife's face. It's the face I've seen a million times, and it's my wife's face. And for that reason, I don't often pay attention to distinct details. It's just a habit of human nature that Tolkien is recognizing is kind of a problem if what we're really after is what he was talking about earlier, this whole idea of originality. We don't need to just do weirdness for the sake of originality to really recapture that sense. Later on he says creative fantasy, because it is mainly trying to do something else, make something new, may open your hoard and let all the locked things fly away like cage birds. The gems all turn into flowers or flames, and you will be warned that all you had or knew was dangerous and potent, not really effectively chained, free and wild, no more yours than they were you. The fantastic elements in verse and prose of other kinds, even when only decorative or occasional, help in this release, but not so thoroughly as a fairy story, a thing built on or about fantasy, of which fantasy is the core. Fantasy is made out of the primary world, but a good craftsman loves his material, and has a knowledge and feeling for clay, stone, and wood, which only the art of making can give. By the forging of Graham, cold iron was revealed. By the making of Pegasus, horses were ennobled. In the trees of the sun and moon, root and stock, flower and fruit are manifested in glory. And actually, fairy stories deal largely, or the better ones, mainly, with simple or fundamental things, untouched by fantasy, but these simplicities are made all the more luminous by their setting. For the story-maker who allows himself to be free with nature can be her lover and not her slave. It was in fairy stories that I first divined the potency of the words and the wonder of the things, such as stone and wood and iron, tree and grass, house and fire, bread and wine. So the point he's getting at here is that fantasy helps us recover this sense of the awe and the wonder that the child has at new things that we lose as we get older and, as he says, appropriate these things to ourselves, put them in our mental hoard and just kind of forget about them. Now, of course, this isn't what's going on exactly in the Bluey episode, but it's very similar. Bandit has kind of gone on this kind of a odd and strange little adventure of learning to look at things in a new way again, not through fantasy exactly, although it is a fantasy that he was born yesterday, but he's not reading a fairy story in the way that Tolkien is talking about here. What he does is he just actually puts himself in that mode of, I'm somebody who hasn't seen or known anything, and starts looking at things as if he was like that. Fantasy does this for us, Tolkien says, because it basically gives us something to look at that is so distinct from what is our normal experience, that it refreshes the things that are in our normal experience. At one point in the essay, if I remember correctly, it's a long essay and I couldn't find the specific part where he does it. He talks about the idea of a green sun, and how different that would be, and how that, kind of contrasts with our normal experience. And that is one way, it's kind of a ham-fisted, but it's one way to kind of rejuvenate our own sense of our yellow sun. If you think about a green sun in a story, you think how weird that is, but then, in the story, you kind of get used to it, and then you realize our sun is yellow, actually. I had not exactly this experience, but I certainly had a related type of experience when I read Lord of the Rings for the first time, because I got so engaged with the story that I felt like I was reading a history of a world where all these wondrous things existed, elves and dwarves and all this stuff. And of course I never, lost my sense of reality, like all this actually can exist. But when you get that in deep with a story to the point where you kind of invest it with that secondary belief that Tolkien also talks about on fairy stories, it helps you let go of your preconceived notions of what the world is really like, as it were. So when you imagine yourself as really being in this kind of world where these things exist, you come back to your own world with a sense of, this is different. It's not the same, and therefore it's worth paying attention to again in a way that you haven't paid attention to in a long time. So you get the same kind of result that Bandit gets in this. He ends up realizing through pretending to have been born yesterday that there is in fact value in just looking at things for their own sake. He picks up a leaf and he just looks at it like, man, that's actually really cool. Because he hadn't thought about that in a long time, because why would you? We all get busy doing things, especially as adults, that don't really afford us the time to just sit and really engage in that way with nature. But as Tolkien says, when you really craft this kind of a story, or when you just act like Bandit does, you can be nature's lover, not her slave. It's not like nature is just oppressing you with all the things. No, you can actually observe nature and just admire it, and just, be in that kind of a state. Bandit learns this lesson a completely different way than what Tolkien is talking about, but they're not totally unrelated either. Because as I said, Bandit's whole experience starts with the fantasy that he was born yesterday. It's by putting himself in that frame of mind that he reaches this kind of stage of seeing everything as if it really were new. And it's hard to do if you just tell yourself, I should look at grass again, or whatever, or I should just look at the swords on my wall again. But every now and then we do have that urge, because it never, at least I hope for most people, never really leaves us to really just look at things and be just in a state of awe or admiration or wonder or whatever it is at the beauty of the thing itself, or whatever it is about it that's interesting. These swords on the back of my, in the back of my studio here, they're well crafted in terms, not, they're not well crafted as swords, but as beautiful wall hangers, they are well crafted. They look like the original, other than, not being real normal swords. But they're worth looking at because they are pretty. I mean, they just are. So every now and then too, if you're like me, not everybody has this, I guess, but I've been interested in medieval type stuff as long as I can remember. My dad was reading to me as a kid, when I was probably at most 6 years old, stories of King Arthur, and ever since I've always been into this stuff. And so every now and then I just have the urge to hold a sword, and not just hold the sword as a weapon, but to hold a sword as the sword as a thing made, which is beautiful in its own way. Deadly, perhaps, but even in its deadliness, it is beautiful in that the design of it is well done to achieve its goal. We all have that kind of a thing in us, and it's a matter of reawakening it. And Tolkien says this is the value of fairy stories. And he's right, but it's not the only way. You can also kind of get there the way that Bandit Healer does in Bluey, and it's a worthwhile enterprise. So here's a challenge for you this week. If you haven't just stopped and really thought about something as its own and not as just something that you see every day, find an opportunity to do that. You might find that it helps your mental health a little bit, even. I'm not making that as a medical statement disclaimer. But in all honesty, it is good for us to recognize other things as other things in themselves and not merely here for our hoarding away in our mental, hoard, as Tolkien says. We should not be dragons in that way. That is not healthy. So, do that. Whether it's with your spouse, your kids, your just something, of value that you own that is beautiful, or just nature. Go outside and just lay in the grass and really feel the grass. Or, if you don't live in a place where you can do that comfortably without getting lots of bugs all over you, take a walk in the woods and really listen to the sounds and try to imagine the birds that you're hearing, or, whatever. But try to find a way to enter this kind of state and really let go of the things in your mental hoard a bit, and really understand things as other things that are not yours. It's a very interesting experience, and I just thought it was really interesting that, obviously not in the same way, but the end goal was something that the TV show Bluey went for, as something that Tolkien wrote about decades ago. So that's the video for this week. Hope you enjoyed it. If you get anything really interesting out of this, I'd enjoy it if you share it in the comments. Make sure you like and share if you think other people might benefit from watching it or just enjoy watching it. If you haven't actually watched Bluey, seriously, it's almost always hilarious in some way. It's worth a shot. It's a kid's show, but trust me, there's plenty there for adults to get, as I think this discussion will show. So check that out if you haven't before as well. Of course, if you want to catch my future content, make sure to subscribe. And if you're on YouTube, click the bell icon so you don't miss any notifications. On the platform formerly known as Twitter, you can follow me for Tolkien-related trivia questions every week. And there's other support and social links in the description below. Until the next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie. Thanks to all my channel supporters, especially Nathan Dufour, Paul Leone, Robert Kindling, and Stephen Clayton.